I want to just start just by giving some credit where credit is due. I don't do this science all by myself. I've got a great team of postdocs and students that I work with at Utah State. Brendan Murphy was a research associate who worked with me for 3 years, and now he's been up at Simon Fraser for the last year and remains really very much integrally involved in this, leading a lot of this research I'll talk about today. A couple of colleagues that I'll mention some of their work today: Larissa Yoakum, John Chuba, and Belize Lane, who have contributed to this, and a couple of students that they're working with. And then my wildfire work started about 7 years ago, and it was funded by a couple of small pilot projects, and then more recently has garnered some funding from the National Science Foundation and the Joint Fire Science Program, which is a bunch of federal agencies that put money together for this. So this is what I want to spend the next 45 minutes chatting about. The role of fire in Western ecosystems. I want to talk about the good, the bad, the ugly. I think there'll be a few things in there that are going to surprise you about wildfire. We'll geek out for a little bit, talking about science to inform better forest fire and watershed management. I've got 2 slides to talk about how fire, fish, and water security problems are all linked within the broader issue of climate change. And then this will be kind of a low point emotionally, because it's not great. The situation is not great, but it's important to talk about. And then I'll leave you on a high, talking about things that we all can do as individuals, some good things that are happening at the state and federal levels, and some things that you could push for moving forward. So I promise we'll end on a high note. I'll start out just by pointing out that there are 105 active fires going on right now. Maybe some of you are aware of that, but they're all over the place. We've been breathing that air for the last week especially. There have been over 40,000 fire starts just in 2021 alone. And that's above average for a year at this time of year. It's not the highest we've ever had, but it's a lot of fire starts, a lot of fires that have been put out already. But 105 that have gotten away from us and are yet to be contained. We experience wildfire in a lot of different ways. Most of us experience it through our lungs, right? This was just Monday and Tuesday down in Salt Lake and pretty much all throughout this region. The air was almost unbreathable, right? And that's one way that we experience wildfire. Some of us have experienced some devastating losses of homes, cabins, other things we really value. It's devastating to see wildfires get out of control and rip through towns like this. We also experience it through the news. And of course, the news is looking for the hottest, most exciting story to grab your attention and maybe to inform, but definitely to grab your ratings. So cars on fire, houses burned down. That's often what you see, what you experience through the news in terms of wildfire. We also are experiencing wildfire through our wallets, right? This is an expensive thing. So this is a plot that's just showing federal fire suppression costs. So basically, this is the money the federal government's paying to put fires out. This is in billions of dollars. And these green dots are showing you every year, going back to the 1980s. We're seeing a pretty compelling trend here. Fire suppression costs are going way up. Okay, and I'm going to dig into more detail, but that's only a small part of the story. That highest green dot there is from 2017. Over $3 billion in fire suppression costs for all the fires in 2017. But one fire that year, out of hundreds, cost $10 billion in insurance claims. Insurance companies are paying a lot of money for these wildfires getting out of control. And by insurance companies paying it, of course, we're all paying it, right? That's just one fire out of hundreds that year. So it's a huge portion of the cost that we're paying that's hard to add up. you go. There are lots of other costs. Premature mortality, healthcare utilization, lost productivity, people having to get evacuated for days or weeks sometimes. Impacts on quality of life, compromised water quality, loss of endemic or threatened species. It's hard to put numbers on these things, right? But they're real losses. They're things we value that wildfire damages significantly. Damage to critical infrastructure, including reservoirs, which we'll talk a bit about. There's lots of costs here, right? I'll come back to that. Most Americans who consume science get it through news media outlets, right? So what are the news media outlets saying about wildfire? You can look for hundreds of headlines, and many of them will talk about how we've got all these new record highs for wildfire. 2015, there was over 10 million acres burned. People were talking about this as being a record. I want to challenge that here and give you a little bit more perspective on what that really means. Here's the data set that people appeal to when they're talking about that record. It goes back to 1984. And you can see this trend. This is area burned in millions of hectares. A hectare is 2.2 acres. And yeah, it's going up. It's highly variable from year to year. But the reason we focus on this time period is because that's when we started having satellite data. We could measure the wildfires very easily from satellite imagery, right? It's a really good data set. But the Forest Service actually has a much longer data set. It goes back to the early 1900s. And what we see is there was a long time where we were relatively low, but there used to be a lot more fire in the landscape, a lot more. And if you go back even further, we can do this through tree rings and other ways that we're looking at wildfire historically. There was a lot more fire in the Western landscape. 5 to 10 times more fire than we're even seeing today. The West loves to burn. It's just set up to burn, right? And I want to address, so what exactly happened here and what does this all mean? It doesn't mean that, you could look at this and say, well, maybe it's just a cyclical thing, and that's not what's going on, okay? So we used to have a lot more fire. Coming in the early 1900s, there were some big fires that got people's attention, and the Forest Service was newly minted and put in charge of figuring out how to get rid of fires so that we can use that timber for something productive. So Smokey the Bear was one of the most successful marketing campaigns ever. Smokey did a great job of telling people to put fires out. And we started developing technology to just bomb fires with water, drop water on it from the air. We got really good at fire suppression. So what we're really seeing here in this decline is our ability to suppress fire greatly increased. And it was also a little bit wetter time period. After the Dust Bowl, it got a bit wetter. That was also helping keep fire down. What's happened most recently is because of all this fire suppression, we've got a lot of overgrown forests now. I'll talk a bit more about that. And we're also got the driest forest that we've had in decades with climate change. And so fire is increasing because despite any efforts we're putting towards it, we're putting unprecedented amount of efforts towards it right now, they're uncontrollable. Okay? We've lost the ability to suppress fire the way that we did through the mid-1900s. So what does that mean? Okay, in the 1940s, we started seeing that we could control fire, and we said, that's great. Let's start building a bunch of reservoirs out here. We're going to be populating this area. And this blue line is showing reservoir capacity. So all the thousands of reservoirs we built throughout the West during this time, that's how much water we could store in hundreds of millions of acres, acre feet. That's like, imagine an acre of water 1 foot deep. That's what that volume of water is there. So this is hundreds of millions of acre feet from all these dams we built all throughout the Western US. And we did it because we said, okay, we got fire under control. It's no longer a problem. We look at sediment in the Colorado River over that time, and that decreases. over that time, because where was all that sediment going now? Behind the dams, going in the reservoirs, right? So we can see that in the sediment of the Colorado River. And actually a lot of fish in the Colorado River liked that sediment. So taking that sediment out was a problem for them. But because now we've got fire under control and we've got a lot of water storage capacity in the West, we started populating it. So this is population going back to the 1870s. We had less than 1 million people out West. We got fire under control. We've got water storage. And you start to see this change in trajectory. We have a lot more people moving out West. We've got over 70 million people living in the Western 11 states now. We don't have records of where we were building houses going back this whole time, but we do have it going back to the 1980s. And what these houses here are showing is how many millions of houses we built in the wildland-urban interface, what we call the WUI zone. This really vulnerable zone right at the corner, right at the boundary between the wildlands and urban areas where wildfires are most likely to impact. We've got over 22 million homes built right at the wildland-urban interface now. We're dealing with that every day through the fire season. And again, this green line is showing you the fire suppression costs again, the same green dots I was showing you on the previous plot. Those keep going up. So no matter how much money we're throwing at this, we still can't suppress these fires. Okay. So what's being covered at the top is how it's going. By the 1940s, we said, hooray, we got fire under control. How it's going now, we've got bigger, more intense fires that are often uncontrollable upon ignition. Okay. How do we deal with that? How do we manage it moving forward? Here's a little bit of perspective for you. Fire has been around as long as oxygen on this planet. You know, as soon as you have fuels and heat and oxygen, you got fire. And so we've got fire for the last 420 million years. It's been around for a long time. It's not going anywhere. So the real question is, how do we want our fire in the West? How can we manage fire so that we can live better with it? We're going to have smoke. That's an inevitable part of living in the West. How do we want that smoke? We're going to come back to that question, talk about ways that we can manage that smoke so that it's not choking us as acutely as it has been earlier this week. Okay, so I hope I've convinced you that fire is an inevitable part of our future in the West, but we can manage it. I also want you to realize that some fire is good. It does really good things. There are ecosystems like lodgepole pine forests that need fire. They can't regenerate unless they get a really hot fire that actually releases the seeds from their cones. Ponderosa pine is really built for some of these low severity fires that kind of clean out the brush. It cleans these forests up naturally. It also needs, fire at some frequency. Aspen forests also need fire to regenerate. So fire brings about this sense of regeneration in the landscape. It can be a really healthy thing. You can't have many healthy forests without fire. Okay, so there's a little bit of perspective on fire in the Western landscape, and we'll come back and re-hit some of those points. Let's geek out a little bit now on science. And I want to take a little diversion here because I always have to throw in my cheerleading for science because, it gets a lot of bad press sometimes. It's remarkable that scientists figured out just the chemical structure of DNA. When we think about how they did that and how long ago they did that, but now we've not only figured out the chemical structure of it, we figured out how to edit it in all these things. It's really amazing how science has advanced molecular biology. Now, there's lots of ethical considerations and questions that need to be discussed outside of science. But it's just staggering how science has advanced in this field. Science has figured out all of the physics behind lift and drag so that we can get enormous pieces of equipment in the air and fly over oceans and not even think about it. And science has even figured out ways that we're basically flying these things by themselves. Pilots are just sitting there most of the time, right? It's fascinating to see the advances of science and where we've gotten. Over 50 years ago, we shot off government employees and landed them on the moon and got them back 50 years ago. Science did that without even modern computers. I don't know why we're so excited about billionaires getting a quarter of the way now, but anyway, that's a different story. Science did that. In less than a year, we went from identifying a novel virus nobody had ever seen before to developing a vaccine that makes it 95% effective against people getting ill. It's amazing. I love being a scientist in this day and age. I don't get to do any of that work. I actually started out in molecular biology, but now I've turned all my attention to this kind of stuff. And watershed science has a lot of advances it's made as well. We're dealing with some of the most high resolution imagery that we've ever had. We have 6-inch resolution imagery all around the earth that we collect on a regular basis. We're getting all kinds of infrared imagery that we can see all kinds of details that you can't see with the naked eye. And then we've got topographic maps that are thousands of times better than maps we were just dealing with 10 or 20 years ago. The advances in data here are staggering. And a lot of my field is now just trying to catch up with all the data and analysis of these massive data sets and utilizing all this information we have access to. We've got all this radar data that we can take advantage of, another big data set. We have mapped soils and geology and land use all across this country in incredible detail. And we make it freely available. I lived in Ireland for a year and I loved living over there. They don't have much free available data. I came back here really appreciating the amount of available data that we have that's free for anybody to use to do good. It's really a wonderful thing. We've got stream gauges that are monitoring flow on all these rivers all throughout Utah, thousands of places all throughout the western US. And you can get the data in real time. We're doing things like putting tags on fish, and we can monitor where they're swimming all over the place. I even put them in rocks, so I can see how far downstream rocks are moving, and we can develop the math to figure out sediment transport in rivers and then make predictions with it. It's staggering how much data we have available to us. It's a wonderful time to be a scientist. There's lots and lots of science going on in all aspects of wildfire. Lots of people who are looking at predicting the intensity of any given fire that might start, how hot those flames are going to get, how much ash that's going to produce, how much of the trees get burned up, things like that. There's people who are looking at satellite imagery and they're looking before and after a fire and figuring out, well, what can we tell about the condition of the forest and the vegetation, the soils from space. But this is my piece of it, my team's piece of it, I should say. We've been trying to put all these pieces together. And we've built a model, a mathematical model. There's a bunch of equations that come together that allow us to predict how much high severity burn is likely to happen in any given watershed, any given area. How much of it's expected to be really bad. And then using a bunch of rainfall simulations, we can predict the amount of rainfall that's likely to come down on that fire and figure out how much erosion is going to come off the landscape from that, how much sediment, and especially these really catastrophic debris flows. These are events that it rains and a huge amount of sediment comes out and gets dumped into the river. I'll show you a video of those in a second. But we kind of cracked the nut of figuring out how much of that sediment actually gets into the river. Not all of it does. And then how it moves downstream through the river network. And that's the work of John Chuba, who I mentioned at the beginning from Virginia Tech, and a number of others who have figured out, when a gravel grain starts to move, how far downstream is it going to go? It's like a really banal question, right? Mundane question. But it's really important if you want to figure out where it's going to impact fish habitat, or how much of it's going to get down to a water reservoir down here and start filling in that reservoir so that we all of a sudden can't use that space to store water. It's filled in with sediment. So that's where we're going here. So we've developed this model, and we've added, with Larissa Yoakum's expertise, ways to model fuel treatments. So we can say, here are the places where it's most likely to be really bad. What if we went in and did some kind of thinning or prescribed burn or other fuel treatments? How much better does that make the erosion? And what are the implications for fish habitat then and sediment downstream? This is a debris flow. So this is about a 40-foot wide channel you're seeing, just to give you a sense of scale. This is, these are 10-foot boulders that are coming down through this channel. And they're being pushed by this mix of water and mud and sand and a bunch of gravel that's mixed in there. And you don't want to be in front of these things. They just move out of the way, whatever is in front of them. These occur all the time after wildfires. And it's critical that we start using these models to figure out not only where are they going to form, but how far downstream is that sediment likely to get. So we've developed this model, and we've applied it to, it's unfortunate you can't see part of this, but to the Twitchell Canyon fire. So this burned back in 2007 down in the Tusher Mountains in central Utah. This should be a little gray blob right down here where the Twitchell Canyon fire was. This is the Clear Creek watershed, and you can see all the streams that make up the Clear Creek watershed. And we could predict how much sediment came down in these debris flows. Every one of these dots is a debris flow that brought sediment down. So it's sediment that's down in the river valley. This is the color of the dot is telling you how much sediment came down. And then we can model how far downstream that sediment moves. So I'm going to put this in motion, and we're going to run through about 7 years in a couple seconds here. But it shows you these pulses of sediment moving. And you can see places where it's building up in the channel network. These are places where fish are most likely to be impacted, sometimes positively, sometimes negatively. You can see sediment occasionally when the flows go way up, sediment's getting all the way out to the basin outlet here. If there were a reservoir there, they get deposited in the reservoir. So we're able to use this to make these kinds of predictions. That ends up being really important. This is just an example from Colorado of how expensive it is to dredge sediment out of the reservoirs when it gets down there. So this is Strontia Springs Reservoir in Colorado. There were 2 wildfires in its watershed, similar to what I just showed you. About 1 million cubic yards of sediment came down after those wildfires, much of it in debris flows. And this is what happened with the amount of storage capacity that they were losing. They were projecting to lose this amount on this white line here. Oops. They lost about double that amount. A lot of additional sediment that was unexpected came down from those fires. Cost $30 million to dredge that sediment out. It's really expensive. There's also big plumes of ash that came in and caused a lot of water quality problems. They had to stop using this reservoir, and Denver had some serious water quality problems for a couple of months when they could no longer use this primary reservoir of theirs. We have some of these same problems happening here in Utah as well. When we look around today at our reservoirs, it's not great, right? This is a map showing 137 large reservoirs throughout the state of Utah. That's the blue things. They have their watersheds that are outlined in white there. And we're studying all of these with that model to figure out which watersheds, which reservoirs are most vulnerable to post-wildfire sedimentation and what can we do about it. These are data from DWR showing in blue the total capacity of all of these reservoirs. This is about 5.5 million acre feet we have in storage throughout all these reservoirs. And as of July 1st, they were only 66% full. So we're not doing great. It's been drawn down quite a bit from there. But the bigger concern that I have is the sediment filling in, so that not only do we have not very much water in the reservoir now, but we're actually losing capacity to store water in the future. This is a plot showing reservoir storage capacity in Utah over time. So this is going back to the before 1900. And as we built all these reservoirs, here's the Bear Lake Reservoir, added 1.5 million acre feet. These are all the reservoirs we built throughout the state. And that's the total amount of water we could store throughout the state. And if there was zero sedimentation, there's no sediment coming in those reservoirs, we'd still have all that capacity, right? We could store all that water. But we know there's been sediment coming into those reservoirs. And so this red line was an estimate of how much capacity we've lost, okay, from sediment coming in. And they were basically just estimating we're losing about 0.2% per year. But they didn't have very good numbers on that. They'd only measured sedimentation in 18 of them, 18 of 137. Right? So the other thing they weren't taking into account was wildfire. Because they did this study in 2010. We hadn't had very many big wildfires in Utah in recent times before 2010. 7 of the 10 biggest wildfires in our state history have happened since 2010. So they were not taking into account wildfire. So when we add wildfire into this mix, how much more quickly do we lose capacity here? We're helping DWR now figure out how much capacity we've actually lost so we can improve on that 0.2% number. And we're working with Aggie Air. They have these amazing drones. They go and fly those over the reservoirs and take really high resolution imagery that they can turn into topographic maps, really high resolution topographic maps. Every time I move that, this decides to stop working. And then we have a sonar instrument, basically, that we run all across the reservoir, just like we're mowing the grass, going back and forth and mapping the reservoir itself. And so we end up with a 3D map of the reservoir. We can compare that to the surveys when it was built, and we can figure out how much sediment has been deposited in there. We've only got complete results from 5 reservoirs so far. First Dam, Smith and Morehouse, Little Dell, Upper Stillwater, and Red Creek down here. And some good news is all of these are below the global average of reservoir sedimentation. So we're doing a little bit better than global average. But this line is that assumed infill rate, that 0.2% loss. And all of them that we've measured so far are above what they were assuming. 3 of these have had recent fires in 2017, 2016, and 2020. So there's still a lot of sediment that's yet to come into those. We expect those rates to go up a bit because of those fires. But we're at least putting some real numbers on sedimentation infill rates in the reservoirs. So, okay. Let's switch a little bit from reservoirs and talk about the fish side of things. Fish don't ask for much. That's what my title says underneath that. They're very simple creatures. They want water, especially cool water for a lot of species. They want some places to hide. They want some places they can go to get out of really fast water or during drought years, so they need pools. And they want a little bit of food, right? That's all they ask for. Wildfire makes all those things really difficult in the short term, under most conditions. This is actually right after the Twitchell Canyon fire. This is one of the streams that was draining that watershed. You can see this is just chock full of ash. Imagine being a fish in there. You wouldn't have to imagine for long. This killed a lot of fish when this initially came down. And in other places, you get these debris flows that come down. They bring a lot of sediment, and they just pile up sediment. So this has buried the channel 5 or 8 feet underneath all of this sediment. That's a problem for fish as well. Now, eventually the stream will work through that, but this is kind of disconnected a portion of the stream. But fish evolved with fire. They knew how to deal with it. When there was some bad stuff coming downstream, they would just go downstream, go somewhere else. When things were good again, they'd come back. Right? They were very resilient in that respect. The problem is we've put in thousands of obstacles. Water diversions. This is the Weber River. You can see all these blue, red, and yellow dots here are different water diversions, bridge crossings, things like that, that impede fish movement. And so in so many of our river systems now, fish can't just move out of the way and come back when it's good again. We've fragmented them to the extent that they don't have a way to get back and recolonize. So this interaction is problematic. But I want to also show the other side of this, because wildfire is not just bad for fish, right? These wildfires are bringing in all those beautiful boulders that I showed you in that debris flow, right? Well, those beautiful boulders end up creating great fish habitat as well. This is an area in where the Twitchell Canyon fire burned, beautiful part of the stream. It's got a bunch of these boulders. Those were all brought down by debris flows from wildfires over the past thousands of years. And they create great fish habitat. Fish will love to hang out behind these. They can watch for food, jet out and eat some food and just go back into the nice eddy behind the boulders. We've got a lot of rivers that are starved of sediment. They're lacking sediment because we've been suppressing fire for so long. And so this is another way that fire helps rejuvenate the landscape and rejuvenate ecosystems. A lot of streams are deprived of sediment. Anybody know where this is? Very close, yeah. Yeah, this is the Strawberry River, just west of Duchesne, yeah. Yep, so just about maybe 20 miles west of Duchesne. This was burned by the Dollar Ridge Fire. And, you know, it's created this beautiful mess. And there's all kinds of diverse habitat down here for fish. They can find lots of places to hang out. This is another drone image of that Strawberry River. The Strawberry River didn't used to look like that. It was a very plain river. It had been really starved of sediment for a long time. Well, it's got a lot of sediment to work through now. But that's a bit of the science that we're doing to inform watershed management. We're working really closely with a set of stakeholders, local, state, and federal agency staff to make sure that all the science we're doing ends up getting put into practice. Okay, we've got about 15 minutes left. I've got these two slides linking this to climate change, and then we'll talk about what we can all do. It doesn't make sense to give a talk on wildfire without talking about climate change at this point. And I am now known for reaching out to journalists who write about extreme weather events and saying, great story, but you've got to link it to the ultimate cause. Climate change is causing higher frequency of droughts, higher frequency of floods, higher frequency of wildfire. And here's the problem, as concisely as I can put it. This is global energy consumption from all of these different sources. Coal, oil, gas, nuclear, and the little green band going up here are all global renewables. Okay, this is going back to 1800. You can see how emissions from coal, oil, and gas have gone up a lot, even since the 90s. I mean, we knew everything we needed to know about climate change in the 90s. You can see how much coal, oil, and gas have all gone up since then. This is ultimately the big problem. Here's how it plays out in Utah. So we're in a severe to exceptional drought all throughout the state right now, as I'm sure you're all well aware. We've been saying since the 90s that this is what climate change is likely to cause here in Utah. Less snowpack, a lot more drought through the summer. We're going to see more and more of this. Globally, this is the coldest summer that any of us will experience in the rest of our lives. That's a shocking statement, but it's true. This is a photo from just a week and a half ago, August 1. We're kayaking downtown Salt Lake, right? We get these atmospheric rivers that just dump a tremendous amount of water in the middle of a drought. We're still in a drought, but we get this very targeted amount of water coming down in sometimes very inconvenient places. As the air warms up, it can hold more water. And so to some extent, that means it doesn't rain as much, but it means there's a lot more water up there. So when it comes down with fury. If we look historically at snowpack, this is how snowpack has changed all throughout the western US. Blue means the snowpack has gone up between, this is 1955 to 2013. Red means it's gone down, right? And so there's a lot of red dots in there. A lot of places throughout Utah where we've lost 20 to 40% of our snowpack over that time period. And that trend is only going to continue and accelerate in the future. Just on Monday, the latest report from the IPCC came out. This is a big report, except that it said essentially the same exact thing we've been saying since the 90s, right? For Utah, it's more drought, less snow, more dust, more wildfire, more heat stress. We've been hearing this for a long time, and yet, remember that previous slide, the emissions just keep going up. We have to solve that problem, and we can. But again, bringing it back to wildfire, it's not a question of whether we're going to have wildfire or not. It's how do we want the fire and how do we want the smoke. Okay, we'll be uplifting from here. Let's talk about what we can do at the individual, state, and federal level. At the individual level, one of the most important things you can do is vote. And vote for people who are going to eliminate fossil fuels. That's the only way we get out of this problem. And that may make some people uncomfortable, depending on whatever your political disposition is. I'm happy to talk more about that. But there's no way out of that climate change problem without eliminating fossil fuels as quickly as we can. And there are ways to do it. We have all the technology we need to do it. We need political will to do it. Once you've elected people, you have to talk with them. You have to let them know that this is a priority and that this is ultimately the big driver of not just wildfire, but a lot of these other problems. And we want to leave our kids a better world. There's a big movement right now, Call for Climate, where they'll link you right up with your senator, Senator Romney or Senator Lee, and you can tell them how important this issue is to you. Another thing that you can do is, we have to be developing smarter. And if you're in a place where your own property is at risk for wildfire, there are a lot of good things you can do to reduce that risk. And I'll point out Utah State Forestry Extension has some great resources here to help you figure out what you can do within your own property. Again, at the state and national level, I'll reiterate, the number one priority has to be eliminating fossil fuels. Anything else we do doesn't matter if we don't solve this problem, right? The Utah legislature funded the Kem Gardner Institute to develop a roadmap for Utah to get in line with the Paris Agreement. They developed a great roadmap. Utah legislature has not made much progress on it. They need to be hearing from people that we want them to make progress on it. They have the roadmap now, they know what to do. There are lots of other things that go into this. Putting a price on our carbon emissions, increasing renewables, developing better carbon-free transportation methods, things like that. But ultimately, that's the big lever. The more things that we can do that are more focused on forest and fire management, or fuel reduction. Now, this is a complicated issue in Utah, but it's going to require us to do some prescribed burns and to some extent thinning of forests. And nobody wants to be walking around the forest and hearing chainsaws or whatever else they're doing to take trees down, but ultimately it's making the forests healthier. Aspen restoration, I'll talk about really briefly, and then beaver restoration is another big new thing. We can get these guys to go work for free for us. Ultimately, this is a people problem. It was created by people, it has to be solved by people, and that means we need to be building partnerships. And I'll talk just really briefly. I really just have a couple more minutes and we'll be done. But the partnerships are essential to work on efficiently on bold and comprehensive watershed management. Okay, so I mentioned this before, all these costs from fire suppression, insurance claims, all these other costs, many of which we're not really accounting for. What I want to point out here is this is federal investments in fuel treatments and other mitigation measures. It's a paltry amount relative to all these other costs. We're not investing enough up front to reduce the wildfire severity. And this is where a change in strategy is readily doable. We can decide to flip this around and say, let's take more preventative measures, and it's going to make all the rest of these costs decline. Maybe not immediately, but certainly within a foreseeable time frame, it's going to make all the rest of these costs decline. That's the one big push that I would make in terms of forest management investments. This is an unpopular one, but we need to be fighting fire with fire. Like I said, it's not a matter of if there's fire, it's how we manage it, right? There's a lot of opposition. There are a lot of regulatory obstacles to putting fire in the landscape, going around and literally starting stuff on fire, right? It could go wrong. There's no question. And it has gone wrong in some cases. But we need to be providing some space for this because, number one, we can choose when we get our fire in this case. And we can choose times when the fire is going to be, the smoke rather, is going to be blown away from urban areas and not towards urban areas. Now, if we're just letting the wildfire take care of this for us, we don't get to make those choices. But with prescribed burns, we do. The amount of smoke, I picked a terrible picture here because this is really dense smoke coming off this prescribed burn, but generally speaking, prescribed burns have far less smoke coming off them than wildfires do. On the order of 10-fold less smoke, less concentration of smoke. So prescribed burns are really tough right now. There's a lot of regulations against them. We regulate them under all of our clean air regulatory structure. So we keep saying, no, you can't do this, you can't do that. But then wildfires, of course, don't obey our clean air regulations, right? So when wildfires occur, they just happen and the smoke's a lot worse. But prescribed burns are a really important tool that we have here in Utah. This is another big one that we've started here in Utah, and Colorado has been very ambitious in this, restoring aspen stands. I love aspen stands. These are so beautiful to see out in the landscape. But they're also really important from a fire perspective because they tend to be very wet timber. They don't burn very well. And you start to create a really mixed burn severity throughout the landscape. You don't have just entire forests going up in high severity. You get this patchwork. And this is another great tool moving forward. Beaver restoration is a big deal right now. And one of my colleagues at Utah State, Joe Wheaton, has been one of the pioneers in this over the last 10 years. Just getting these critters back in the landscape. You get them in there and you give them a little bit of a head start, literally by drilling fence posts in the stream. And that they're doing this at Swanner here as well. They're putting in dozens or hundreds. Yeah. Hundreds of these beaver dam structures. The beaver take over and they create, again, this beautiful mess that fish love. It keeps it moist. So, in this case, this fire was able to to get from one hill slope to the other. But in a lot of cases, this nice, moist riparian zone will stop fires altogether. It also stops some amount of sediment getting through the system. So, beavers do it for free. It's great. And then this is another, I think, real bright point on the state front. The state has invested just in the last 2 years, $5 million per year in what they call the Shared Stewardship Program. This has been a tremendous success. This is basically getting all the local, state, and federal agencies together, talking to make more comprehensive, holistic decisions about fire, about managing forests, fuel treatments, things like that. There's a big outreach to landowners as well as part of this. And, $5 million is great. That was very much, in my opinion, a pilot project. We've demonstrated success with it. We need some real investment. This is the kind of thing that's going to turn this picture around and reduce all those other costs we were talking about. So these are 4 points I hope you take away from this. And I'm happy to stick around and talk more with folks here or on Zoom. There is no fireless future in the Western US. I hope I've convinced you of that. All we can do is manage it. If managed well, we really can minimize damage to society, and we can actually enhance ecosystems. We can choose when, where, and how we get our fire and smoke, primarily by using prescribed burns, or we can just keep rolling the dice and see what nature gives us. I haven't been too impressed the last couple of years, right? We built millions of homes, tens of millions of homes, and thousands of reservoirs under a false sense of security. We have to own that. We can say, oops, it wasn't malicious. It wasn't even, I don't know if I'd even say it was short-sighted. It was a different world going back in the 40s and 50s. I certainly could not have foreseen where we've gotten to here now. I don't blame people that started that trend. I don't think that's helpful. But looking forward, we need to take care of people who are in these vulnerable positions now, who have houses that are in the WUI zone, as well as the ecosystems. And more than anything, we got to stop digging the hole deeper. Right? We keep building in those vulnerable places after we have seen this story play out. We're only going to see fire suppression costs continue to go up the longer we keep building in those places. Wildfire and fragmentation pose big threats for fish populations, and we can work on this from both ends. We can put more good fire in the landscape, and we can also work on that fragmentation problem, removing some of those diversions, making it easier for fish to move around. And the DWR here is working very actively all throughout the state on those problems. And the last point I'll leave you with is we've got to get those fossil fuels turned off. I did my best to minimize the amount of time I talk about this here. If you want more, you can watch my TED talk about it. I don't mince words in it, but it's a serious situation at this point. There's no time to mince words. I really appreciate your attention. I'm glad you're here. I'm happy to open it up for questions now. Thank you.
Large megafires are much hotter and more intense, that ecosystems just aren't going to be able to recover, like the pine cones actually heat beyond, they're not going to open up because they're just destroyed. So can you talk about that a little, and what we can do about that?
Yeah, just in case people on Zoom probably couldn't hear the question. So the question was about these megafires being more intense to the point that the forest can't regenerate. And that's absolutely true. We're seeing in a lot of places the intensity of the fire has gone up because we've let the forest overgrow and because the forests are just so dry. So that's why we're getting these megafires that are more intense than certainly we've seen or that would be natural. And yeah, in some cases, they are getting temperatures that just incinerate everything, including the seeds, even for lodgepole pine. But there are a lot of forests that aren't adapted to those really high temperatures anyway. If anybody's been to where the Hayman fire was in Colorado, it was at the time the largest wildfire in Colorado state history. It was unfortunately started by a Forest Service employee who was burning love letters on a windy day. She actually went to prison for a while, but it was a ponderosa pine forest. And those ponderosa pines don't like intense fire. They like low severity burns that just kind of clean things up, and they're very adapted to that. It incinerated the entire forest, over 100,000 acres. And I haven't been there in the last 4 or 5 years, but when I was there then, there were virtually no trees even sprouting. It was a moonscape. And that's because the ponderosa just had not evolutionarily adapted to that. It's tragic to be losing these ponderosa forests. Same thing with the redwoods. I just finished a big project out in the redwood forests. Redwoods have these really thick, spongy barks. They couldn't care less about fire under natural environments. And fire comes through and just cleans things up. They're happy enough, keep going on for a couple thousand years. Now we're seeing these ladder fuels that can climb up into the canopies. And that's something that the redwoods were not used to. But it's all this fire suppression that's allowed those ladder fuels to climb. And now we're seeing horrific fires in some of those. At some point, those redwood forests may transition over to chaparral. That's a devastating thought. And having been out in those forests and just been, stoned at how, beautiful those forests are. So the answer is thinning in a lot of those cases when we can. I mean, if we can clean out some of those ladder fuels, that's going to be one way to reduce the intensity of those fires. In some cases, we can still do prescribed burns. We have to be very selective about when we're doing those prescribed burns. In some cases, clearing out patches, clearing out fire breaks, things like that are going to help too. But yeah, the mega fires are not going away soon. It's going to take a while to get ahead of those.
Was wondering your thoughts on letting wildfires burn larger when they do occur, other than big structures, and instead of trying to contain them right away and letting them burn. They want to know would doing this increase the chances of fires occurring more often?
It will, and this is a really touchy subject. The Twitchell Canyon fire in 2007 was one of these that raised a lot of eyebrows, because this is one, it was started by lightning, and the Forest Service said, well, there's not a lot of danger, it's relatively low risk, let's let it burn. And in 24 hours, winds kicked up and it got out of control and burned 45,000 acres. About a third of that was at high severity. And that was a case where DWR was furious, the Division of Wildlife Resources, because they'd been managing these fish populations there, spent a lot of money trying to protect these fish populations, and they were devastated. It wasn't necessarily a foreseeable event. But I still think, well, I can't go back and say whether it was the right decision to make for that fire. What I will say is that we definitely need to be looking at opportunities to let the fire take care of the problem for us. We just have to be really careful that they're not getting out of control. And there's a lot of talk here about how much protection should we give people who are making those calls, right? Imagine yourself being in that position, knowing everything I just told you about how out of control our forests are, how problematic the future of fire is, knowing we have to get the fuels down, and at the same time knowing that, well, maybe your house actually isn't that far away. These are tough decisions to make. I certainly think some level of protection for those people in cases where it gets out of control is appropriate. But, yeah. There are. And I would say that Utah has been moderately successful with it, but we do have a lot of restrictions. Colorado has done quite a bit more. They've been a bit more aggressive than we have. But it's always a difficult conversation to have with the public, because a lot of the public is saying, no, I don't want you to start a fire. You know, there's no upside for that for that right now. So there's a lot of public education that I think needs to happen to really loosen that up. And I'll give Casey Snyder some credit. He's one of our state legislators. He's also a fire ecologist. And he's been one of the people who has been pushing to say, let's rethink the number of regulations. And should we really tie all of our prescribed burns to the same air quality standards as everything else, if they're preventing some of these much more catastrophic events? And I think it makes a lot of sense. So, yeah. Yeah, so I wouldn't be the expert on that, but from what I know, they absolutely use a lot of fire to manage wildlife. They very much appreciated that these wildfires are essential for regeneration of the landscape, and that wildlife uses these burned areas in different ways. And so that was a big reason that they were using wildfire. They were also using it because they recognize that the more they use it and keep the forests at multiple age stages, the less likely it is that you have these absolutely catastrophic wildfires that end up with these mega fires. So burning lots of areas in much smaller quantities was kind of their approach to it. That's about the extent that I know. But Larissa Yoakum would be a good person to reach out to about that at Utah State.
There was a question very similar to that asked what your thoughts on those.
I think it's great. I think we need to be doing more of it. I think it's as long as we're doing it at the right times, I think we can clean up a lot of forest that way and have a lot better outcomes in terms of air quality and forest health. I'll be very interested to see what Secretary Holland, sort of first Native American Secretary of the Interior, if she brings more attention to those types of approaches that people have been using for thousands of years because they work, and starts to shift some of our national federal agencies over to more that way of thinking. So I'm not being very good at repeating the question. Sorry about that. But yeah, so the question was, is there a way to thin the forest without burning it? And there is. I mean, you can get in there with tractors. You can get in there and remove that timber and sell it. You can also do what they call broadcast burn, where they'll just pile it up in places and then do very controlled burns on that. They've done that in the Logan River watershed a fair bit. Utah doesn't have a whole lot of valuable timber left. I mean, all of that was cut very early on. So I'm not expecting a resurgence of the Utah timber industry. And that's one of the problems, is that a lot of people are looking at those approaches and saying, we'll do thinning when it pencils out, when we can sell the timber for the amount that it costs to get in there. And I think that's the wrong idea, because it's just led to all these other costs that we're paying anyway in terms of wildfire. So I would argue that getting back in there and doing more of that mechanical thinning, as much as we hate to hear chainsaws going in a forest, things like that. It's going to create much healthier forests. And some of this shared stewardship funding has gone towards projects like that, but on very small scales. We need it on a much bigger scale. I live up in Logan, and I don't know how many of you have been to the Logan watershed, but there's way too many fuels up there. I'm terrified at a forest fire getting started anywhere near the Logan watershed, because it'll just rip through those forests. They're ready to burn, and we need probably a lot of thinning to be done up there. And they're doing some of it. Last year they did some and very nearly lost control of a broadcast burn that they were doing, and that scared everybody, but they got it under control. Question?
One of the problems is that dead forests, eucalyptus, just terrifying. I mean, I can't. That's
Yeah.
another way. I'm like, there's no way out of here. What happens if it goes up?
Yeah.
Look at Rob's trail here. I think one of the problems is these dead tree stands aren't merchantable. That's not merchantable timber.
Right.
And so there's no value in pointing out. So, but isn't there some good news in here in that we've been fighting fires for 100 years, maybe too aggressively, and we have all this overgrowth. With all these fires, I mean, isn't Mother Nature catching up? Isn't there some point where I keep hearing about these million-acre fires? How many acres are there that can burn? It's just maybe there's hundreds of them.
There are the question was mainly.
I'll rephrase it in a simple way. There was a time when these forests were burning, and then we stopped it for 100 years.
Yeah.
And now it's kind of catching up. It's like the echo, right?
Yeah.
I mean, isn't there a time where it'll eventually burn itself out, and nature is kind of catching up?
So yeah, the question is, is nature catching up with all these fires that are happening? We're talking about, on average, around 5 million acres per year burning recently. And I don't have off the top of my head the exact acreage, but I would guess we're talking more like 400 or 500 million acres that has to burn. So we're still only burning, 1 or 2% of it, right? But in 100 years, then all those fires that burned will have regrown as well. So we've got to be much more aggressive about it. Even the level of fire that we see in the landscape today won't come close to keeping up with the regrowth. We've got to be more aggressive with, all these different techniques I talked about. You go back to that one of those first plots I showed you that showed that huge red bar from hundreds of years ago, and then going down to the recent data of how much was burned. That gives you an idea of, we used to burn, or the West used to burn 5 or 10 times more than what we're seeing today every year. 4 to 12% of the entire Western U.S. would be on fire every year, and now we're below 1%. Yeah. Yeah.
I have one more question for you here. This was Larry submitted this right at the beginning, but he wants to know, he's on the board of an HOA here in Park City, and he wants to know what are some best practices an HOA can do to mitigate wildfire risk, and then including in that risks from land adjoining their land.
Yeah. So I'll say. Talk to USU Forestry Extension. I mean, there are a lot of great people there that can look very specifically at your situation. And there are a couple of really good resources on their website, as a number of other websites. But clearing a safe space around your house is one really important step. We're moving towards using less flammable building materials. We're way behind on that, right? I mean, of course, you're in the forest. You want to build a log cabin, right? Or you want to build a wood cabin. Turns out that's not a great idea. But we're getting a lot more inflammable materials that you can use for building those settings. But I grew up in an old growth forest in Missouri. It was an old growth hardwood forest. I know what it's like to just love going outside and seeing these amazing old trees. I get it, but we got to stop building those places. You know, we're all paying for the price of protecting those when, not if, but when the fire comes. You know, let's pull back. Let's go visit those places. But we can't keep building in them. That's my opinion anyway.
I have one more from the virtual audience. So Brad asked, Swanner has a lot of 70-plus-year-old, Swanner and the surrounding areas have a lot of 70-plus-year-old sagebrush. And they want to know, is there data around thinning sagebrush as mitigation and is it just trees?
Oh, that's a great question, and I'll just be honest. I have no idea. I know sagebrush burns very hot, but to what extent they're overgrown in places and you'd want to do mechanical thinning in them, I don't know. Larissa Yoakum would be a great person to reach out to answer that question. Yeah. And other folks at USU Extension as well. Smells great when they burn, but as long as you're nowhere close to it. Yeah, they burn really hot. I used to work in a place in Wyoming that had a bunch of huge glacial boulders, and you could see how hot the fires were in the sage around them because the boulders would just shatter because of the heat from the sagebrush fires. Just gets really, really hot.
Anyone else have questions?
No. Well, yeah, I was just going to say I really appreciate your time. I had my email address in the first and last slides there, but you can also just look me up, Patrick Belmont. Always happy to talk more. Okay.
I will share his resources and anything that he has to share with you, as well as his contact information in the follow-up email. And then I will also share that survey. So if you could take a moment to fill that out, that'd be great. And then you talked briefly about those Beaver Dam analog projects that we'll be putting in. And we do need help building those. It's a really fun opportunity to get into the stream, to put on some waders and help to do some really cool restoration. And so those are on our website under the volunteer tab. We have a whole bunch of projects coming up, so you can volunteer for those. And then join us on the 26th for the outdoor film screening of Beaver Believers, which is a really cool film all about beavers. Thank you, everyone. Go ahead.
Very last thing, and I promise this is it. But on this topic of insurance, one of the things that you guys should be aware of is that insurance companies have looked at this problem and said it's too expensive. The amount they can increase premiums is regulated, but whether or not they offer coverage is not regulated. So I don't know if I'll call it an insidious thing. The big problem is that insurance companies are just dropping coverage. And now people, these 22 million homes we have in the WUI, people are not able to get coverage in some places. And I don't like that one bit. So anyway, thanks so much for being here. Take care.